So Hitler was very careful not to alienate people over their religious views.
And now on Book TV, we want to introduce you to Professor Richard Weikart. Where do you teach and what do you teach?
I teach at California State University Stanislaus, and I teach modern European history, mostly 19th and 20th century Europe.
How many books have you written?
I've written 6 books so far.
And your 2 most recent are?
The 2 most recent ones are The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life, and then Hitler's Religion. Both of those came out in 2016.
Well, let's start with The Death of Humanity. What's the premise?
The premise is that over the past several centuries, since the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, secular philosophies of various sorts, and I cover a whole wide range of ideologies, have undermined the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic, thus leading us into what some people refer to as a culture of death, where abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and such are fairly widely embraced, by, at least especially among the intellectual elites.
And when you talk about the sanctity of life ethic, what's the definition of that?
I'm talking about the idea that every individual is equal and has inalienable rights. In fact, in the opening of the book, I talk about the Declaration of Independence in the way that Jefferson phrased it there, which is that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. And I focus on both of those issues, of the issue of human equality, that all humans are equal, and that all humans have inalienable rights, and among those the right to life. And so I'm specifically looking at the way that the secular thought over the past couple of centuries undermined that idea that humans are equal and that humans have inalienable rights, especially the right to life.
Well, Professor Weikart, why do you say that secular thought has undermined that? How has that happened in your view?
Well, in fact, if you look at the secular thinkers themselves, many of them will admit that it has done that. If you look at what they say about issues of human rights and such. Now, we sort of have them talking out of both sides of their mouth in some ways. In fact, many will admit that there are some kind of human rights. Others will admit flat out that no, because there is no God, because there is nothing transcendent, that therefore humans just make up their own rights. Humans make up their own morality, and so that doesn't give you any kind of fixed morality to go on, which would include the right to life. And many of them, if you look at how they then spin that out into issues such as abortion and infanticide and euthanasia, they will argue quite forthrightly that certain people are not equal to others. There's a so-called personhood theory that people like Peter Singer at Princeton and many other bioethicists embrace, which claims that humans are only valuable if they have certain capacities, and usually rationality is one of the big capacities that they talk about a lot. So that means that humans aren't all equal. So many secularists themselves will admit that human inequality goes along with their viewpoint, and I show how that spins out in secular thought over the past couple of centuries.
How do you show that?
Well, by looking at their own works and what they've said themselves about these issues, and showing that many of them themselves admit that this is the implications of their view. Now, I don't claim that all of them will say that. In fact, what I do try to show too is that many of them actually contradict themselves, because many of them do, at some level, do think that human life has value. Their philosophy claims it doesn't, but they will say that it does. Let me give you a great example of this that I bring out in my book that really blew me away when I was working on the book. Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous philosophers, British philosopher in the early 20th century. Bertrand Russell said quite forthrightly in his philosophy that humans were insignificant. He even called them parasites on this planet. He made clear that human life has no specific meaning, no transcendent purpose. And he also claimed that morality is just an emotion, just a feeling that we humans have. But then if you look at his personal life, you find out that he was a moral absolutist in a lot of ways. In fact, his daughter, Catherine Tate, wrote a book called My Life with Bertrand Russell, where she actually says this. She says he was a moral absolutist in a lot of ways.
What does that mean?
Well, that is that he actually did believe that there were moral absolutes. He did believe that there were objective morality. He went to jail for campaigning against nuclear disarmament and such. And why was he against nuclear disarmament? Because he believed that human life did have some kind of value or purpose, even though his philosophy said it didn't. So while his philosophy said that human life doesn't have any transcendent meaning or purpose or significance, on the other hand, he couldn't live that way. And I try to show that in my book.
And you talk also about Professor Eric Pianka.
Yes.
Who is that?
Yeah, Eric Pianka is a professor of ecology at the University of Texas. And a number of years ago, he gave a talk at the Texas Academy of Sciences where he was receiving an award. And at that event, he said that it would be a good thing if 90% of the population, human population, would be obliterated, perhaps through an Ebola. He was hoping that maybe Ebola would go airborne, and that this would then obliterate the 90% of the human population, because he thinks we're way overpopulated. And this is just a very graphic example. Obviously, this is extreme, but this is a graphic example of the kind of way that this dehumanizing ideology has sort of percolated into our society. He kind of backed off. Once this came out in public, he kind of backed off of it. But I actually downloaded some things from his website before he was able to do any damage control. And he actually had student evaluations that were posted to his own website that said that he'd said this in class, that he'd wanted 90% of the human population to be obliterated. Now, he wasn't promoting doing that. He wasn't saying we should do something to actively kill people. You know, he's a nice guy. But on the other hand, his philosophy leads in a direction that is dehumanizing.
Professor Weikart, what is the effect of the Enlightenment and the Reformation on our thinking about life?
Well, I would say the Enlightenment had a bigger impact on the thinking in particular about the value of human life. And part of the reason for that was because even though people in the sort of the mainstream Enlightenment, like Thomas Jefferson would have been an Enlightenment, very heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. Of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence that I already referenced about thinking that we have inalienable rights. And many of the Enlightenment figures did believe that there was fixed morality, that there was a God who'd created things and got things started, created fixed moral laws and such. However, there was a radical Enlightenment that took place at the same time. And the radical Enlightenment tended to discard those kinds of ideas and was going to be more important in leading into the kinds of dehumanizing philosophies that I discuss in my book. One figure, for example, was Julien de la Mettrie, who was a French materialist thinker who wrote a book called Man the Machine. And so he construed humans as just a machine. So this then ends up seeing human life as not being any more valuable than anything else in the universe or the cosmos.
How do you view man, by the way?
I see humans as being created in the image of God and thus having sanctity and value in and of themselves, not instrumental value. Some people will say, well, humans have instrumental value, that is for what they can do. Again, if they have rational capacities, like Peter Singer and others who are talking about this personhood theory. But I believe humans have intrinsic value themselves because they're created in the image of God.
Richard Weikart, another book that you've written is Hitler's Religion. Did Adolf Hitler have a religion? Did he have a traditional religion as we think of it?
Well, not traditional as we would think of Christianity, which was the traditional religion in Germany at the time. But one thing that I show is that in Germany there was actually a smorgasbord of religions that were available at the time. And pantheism, which I actually argue was Hitler's religious position, was actually... Pantheism is the idea that nature is God. So the whole cosmos is the same as God. And Hitler, there was a fairly strong tradition of pantheism in the German intellectual sphere, going back to the Romantic movement of the 1790s and the period after that. Hegel was arguably a pantheist. Many certainly interpreted him that way at the time as well as today. There were many other German thinkers that were building on pantheism as well. Hitler, interestingly, of course, was a very shrewd politician, as we all know, and part of his politics was to not alienate people who had various religious viewpoints. In fact, he even said this forthrightly in Mein Kampf. He said that we need to make sure that we don't alienate people over religion, because a prominent Viennese politician who had been prominent in the early 20th century before Hitler's time, well, actually while Hitler was living in Vienna, named Georg von Schönerer, had alienated the Catholics in Austria by leading a Los von Rome movement, which means free from Rome. He wanted to get the people out of the Roman Catholic Church, and that had led his political movement into a tailspin. And so Hitler said, we need to avoid that. So Hitler was very careful not to alienate people over their religious views and to try to present himself. One of the words I use actually in my book is I call him a religious chameleon, because he tried to sort of blend in wherever he could. So there were times actually, and there are many atheist and agnostic websites that will promote this view. Hitler actually did say at one point that he was Christian, that he called Christ, Jesus as Lord and Savior and such. And so there is, you know, in these public pronouncements, there were times in which he did claim to be Christian of a more traditional sort. If you look at his private statements, though, that wasn't the case. Let me give one example. When Hitler and Rudolf Hess one of his right-hand men, were in prison in Landsberg in 1923 to 24 for their involvement in the beer hall putsch. Hess and some of his other inmates had a conversation about religion. After it was over, Hitler talked to Hess and told Hess that I have to play a religious hypocrite because of the masses, not to alienate them. So Hitler was forthrightly, in private, dismissing Christianity, dismissing religion. There's lots and lots of evidence for this, by the way, in Goebbels' diaries, in Himmler's diaries, in the table talks, which I discuss extensively. And I maybe ought to say something about the table talks real quickly here, because some people dismiss the table talks. The English translation of the table talks is not reliable, and that has been shown to be the case. However, we have German editions, and that's the ones I rely on.
What are the table talks?
The table talks were times when Hitler was, during World War II, was in his bunker or in other places where he was at his headquarters, army headquarters, where he had monologues that he gave to generals and other of his entourage that were around him. And these were recorded by Martin Bormann and his secretaries, and then later, now we have them published. And again, the English translations are based upon a perhaps fraudulent, we're not sure exactly, set of documents, so they're not reliable, and I don't use those. But the German ones we have are pretty reliable. There's two editions of them, and they both, if you compare them, which I have, they compare pretty closely, word for word, in fact, in many places there. But again, you don't have to rely just on those. Goebbels kept diaries at the time. Rosenberg kept diaries, which were just rediscovered actually just a few years ago. In fact, I was one of the first scholars to be able to use Rosenberg's diaries in my book, because they were rediscovered after they had been stolen after World War II. So there's a lot of evidence that behind the scenes, Hitler was pretty anti-Christian in his outlook.
As Chancellor and as Führer, what was his relationship with the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church in Germany?
Well, he knew that most Germans, of course, were part of the Protestant Church and/or the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church. So he tread carefully, but it's pretty clear if you look at his actions in relation to the churches that he was trying to dominate and control them in as much as he could, as far as he could, without being too unpopular. There's a very interesting book that Nathan Stoltzfus put out just recently called Hitler's Compromises, where it shows that Hitler was very concerned about popular opinion. You know, we think of Hitler as just this dominating figure who just did whatever he wanted. Well, he was concerned about popular opinion, and he knew how far he could push a lot of times in terms of that. And so he didn't want to alienate people over persecuting the churches too hard, but he did want to undermine their position as much as he thought he could get away with. And so, especially once the war broke out, he sort of tried to tread carefully so that he didn't alienate the German public. But on the other hand, he did a number of things to make clear that he was trying to erode their influence. Let me give just one spectacular example. Chaplains in the military. Hitler didn't cause the military to stop having chaplains, except, by the way, the Air Force did not, since they were formed under the Nazis, and Goering rather was the head of the German Air Force. The German Air Force did not have chaplains, the most Nazified branch of the service. The Army, though, had a much longer tradition. They continued to have their chaplains. Hitler ordered that they be sent out to the front lines, and this has been referred to as the Uriah Order, which was based on an Old Testament order where David had sent Uriah to the front lines to be killed. And this is exactly what Hitler was wanting to do. He was wanting the chaplains to die off in the war. That's just one kind of example. There are all sorts of other ways that he threw up roadblocks to the churches and tried to undermine their influence in quite a variety of ways.
And we've been talking with Professor Richard Weikart about his books, The Death of Humanity and Hitler's Religion. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.